In the spring of 1898, across 10 different cities in 5 different countries, something happened that has never been satisfactorily explained. 10 separate newspapers working without any coordination, without any shared editorial direction, without any apparent awareness of each other, published major front-page stories about buried cities discovered beneath the ground beneath their readers' feet. Some of these cities were found under fields. Some were found under existing towns, their streets running parallel to the modern streets above them, their walls pressed against the undersides of foundations that had been sunk in living memory. Some were found underwater. And then, within the same 7-day window, every single one of those stories disappeared. Not corrected, not followed up, not refuted, simply gone. The editors moved on, the reporters covered other things. The cities and the questions they raised were swallowed back into the... I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Silence from which they had briefly surfaced. What you are about to hear is the documented record of those 10 articles, where the papers published them, what they said they found, who found them, and why, if you trace the ownership structures and the financial pressures on the newspaper industry in that precise moment of 1898, the disappearance of all 10 stories in a single week starts to look less like coincidence and a great deal more like coordination. We begin in the American Midwest, in the city of St. Louis, Missouri, which in 1898 was one of the most powerful cities in the United States. It had the 4th largest population in the country. It was a manufacturing and railway hub, and it was beginning quietly to plan the enormous World Fair that would open its gates in 1904. That fair would go on to produce some of the most inexplicable architectural imagery of the entire Gilded Age. Palaces appearing out of nowhere along the St. Louis waterfront. Classical facades of a scale and precision that the official record attributes to temporary plaster construction, though the photographs look nothing like temporary plaster construction. But in the spring of 1898, 6 years before that fair, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a story on its 3rd page that its editors clearly had not decided how to treat. The headline read something to the effect of "Workmen uncover unusual stonework beneath 7th Street." The article described a crew laying gas pipe who had broken through what they initially assumed was old colonial foundation work, only to find themselves looking down into a vaulted space. The vaulting was described as cut stone, dressed in a way the foreman found inconsistent with anything he had seen from French colonial construction in the region. The stones were larger than typical colonial masonry. The joints were tight in a manner one of the workmen found difficult to account for. The vault itself appeared to extend in both directions along the line of the street, suggesting it was not a single chamber, but part of a continuous structure running beneath 7th Street for an unknown distance. The city's civil engineer came to the site, looked into the opening, and said that further investigation would be required before any conclusions could be drawn. Then the pipe-laying crew was instructed to backfill the opening and continue their work. The opening was sealed. The civil engineer filed no public follow-up report. The Post-Dispatch ran no second story. And 6 days later, when the 7-day window had closed across all 10 cities, the buried vault beneath 7th Street joined a very long list of things that the official record of St. Louis simply does not discuss. The second article came from the Commercial Tribune in Cincinnati, Ohio. Workers laying a streetcar tunnel extension near the waterfront district broke through a layer of consolidated fill and found themselves in a much older space below. What the Commercial Tribune described was not just old stonework. It was a street, a paved surface covered in flat stone fitted together without mortar, running at a slight angle to the modern street grid above it. On either side of the paved surface were the lower portions of walls, their upper sections removed or collapsed, their foundations still in the ground. The paving itself was worn smooth in a way that suggested sustained traffic over a very long period. The stones in the centre of the surface were more worn than the stones at the edges, exactly the pattern you would see on a road used heavily over centuries. One of the streetcar engineers on the project, a man whose surname was Hartwell, made a comment that the Commercial Tribune printed without further editorial comment. He said that the angle of the buried street did not match any colonial or early American town plan he was aware of. As if, he said, there had been a city here on a completely different plan before the one we are standing in now. The Commercial Tribune ran that quote on a Tuesday. By the following Monday, the paper had printed nothing further. The streetcar extension was completed. The tunnel was lined and sealed. The buried street was bricked over and forgotten. The third newspaper was the San Francisco Chronicle. A crew working on sewer infrastructure near the waterfront district broke through a section of bayfill and hit what the supervising engineer described as a seawall, an enormous seawall built from dressed granite blocks of a size he could not account for, running in a line that bore no relationship to the current shoreline. The wall, as far as the crew could determine before being instructed to seal the excavation, ran for at least 60 feet along the line of their trench before disappearing into undisturbed fill on either side. The Chronicle piece pointed out something the supervising engineer found genuinely confusing. The granite used in the wall was not a variety quarried near San Francisco. It was a type more consistent with granite found in the Sierra Nevada range, well over 100 miles from the bay. Transporting stone of that size from the Sierra Nevada to the San Francisco waterfront in any era before the railroad would have been a logistical achievement of the highest order. And the wall, if the fill surrounding it was any indication of its age, was considerably older than 1869. The Chronicle ran the story as a curiosity. It did not call in any academic geologists. It did not ask the city engineer's office for an official assessment. Within the same 7-day window consuming similar stories in St. Louis and Cincinnati, the Chronicle moved on. The waterfront sewer project was completed. The seawall was buried again under fresh concrete, and the city of San Francisco continued building on top of whatever had been there before it. The fourth article brings us to London. The London Evening Standard published a piece in the same spring week describing a discovery made during tunnelling work on an extension of the underground railway system near Aldgate. The article described the uncovering of a sequence of chambers, stone-built, arched, running parallel to the tunnel extension at a depth somewhat below the intended excavation level. The chambers were empty. The floor of each chamber was paved with flat tiles described as Roman in character, but of unusual size. The walls were faced with a material the tunnelling engineer described as not quite Roman cement, and not quite anything he had seen before. What the London Standard story contained that the American pieces did not was a quote from an unnamed official of the Metropolitan Board of Works, who said the chambers would be examined by qualified persons before any decision was made. No qualified persons were ever publicly identified. No examination was ever publicly reported. By the end of the same week, the Standard had moved on. The fifth article appeared in the Boston Daily Globe. The piece described a discovery made during excavation for a new commercial building in the downtown district, in a block that had been continuously occupied since the 17th century. The excavation crew, digging down to bedrock at a depth of roughly 20 feet, encountered a floor, not soil, not colonial fill, a floor. Dressed stone, flat and level, covering an area the crew chief estimated at approximately 40 by 60 feet before it disappeared under the surrounding excavation walls. But it was what was found below the floor that the Globe reporter clearly found most significant. Below the stone floor, accessed through a section that had partially collapsed, was a room whose walls were not stone. They were brick, but the brick was of a type the construction supervisor had never encountered in any other excavation in the city. It was harder than ordinary brick, denser, with a surface the supervisor described as almost glassy. The joints between the bricks were so tight as to be nearly invisible, and the colour was not the red or brown of typical New England brick. It was a dark grey, almost charcoal, and entirely uniform across every brick examined. The Globe ran the story with a photograph of the excavation showing the stone floor and the opening to the space below. The stone floor in the image looks old, the edges are worn, the surface has the uneven, smooth quality that comes from very long exposure to foot traffic. It does not look like something laid in the 17th century. It looks much, much older. By the end of the week, the photograph had not been reprinted. The story had not been followed up. The excavation had been completed, the building constructed on top of the old floor, and the charcoal-coloured room sealed permanently beneath new concrete. No academic institution was ever publicly invited to examine the site. No official assessment was ever published. The 6th article is perhaps the strangest of the 10 in terms of its geography, because it comes not from a major industrial city but from the small regional Natchez Democrat in Natchez, Mississippi. The Democrat story described something found by a farmer whose plough had suddenly dropped into a void. He found that the void was the collapsed roof of what appeared to be a tunnel or passage, stone-lined, running from his field in the direction of the city's downtown district. The Natchez Democrat sent a reporter who went into the passage with the farmer and a lantern. What the reporter described was a passage wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, stone-lined from floor to arched ceiling, dry inside despite the surrounding clay soil, extending several hundred feet in the direction of the old Spanish colonial section of town before a partial collapse blocked further progress. The reporter noted that the stones in the tunnel walls were fitted together in a pattern that accommodated their individual irregularities, each stone placed so its edges bore against the edges of its neighbours without mortar. He described the joint work as resembling a very complicated puzzle, one in which each piece had been selected and positioned with enormous care. It was, he wrote, the finest piece of stonework he had personally ever seen. The Natchez Democrat ran the story once. No second article confirmed whether the farmer excavated further. No city official investigated. The passage, if it still exists, is somewhere beneath the eastern outskirts of Natchez, and the Democrat's one article has been sitting in a microfilm archive for 125 years without the mainstream historical community seeing fit to follow up. The 7th article appeared in the Toronto Globe, describing a discovery made during construction near the city's harbour district. The Toronto Globe reported that a crew had encountered at a depth of approximately 15 feet a section of paved surface of unusual character, and that this surface had been photographed by the construction company's own engineer before being broken up to allow foundation work to continue. The Toronto piece is notable for what it says about the response rather than the discovery itself, because the response was faster and more organised than in any of the other 9 cases. Within 48 hours of the Globe story appearing, the construction company had issued a statement describing the surface as an artefact of early French colonial settlement, entirely consistent with known historical occupation of the harbour area and requiring no further public examination. The official explanation had been provided, boxed and closed within 2 days. The speed of that response is something worth sitting with. Every other story in this set simply faded. No one responded, no one explained. But in Toronto, someone felt the need to explain within 48 hours, to provide an official categorization and close the question before it could be asked out loud. That urgency sits in uncomfortable contrast with the casual indifference of the other 9 cases. It suggests that whoever was watching in Toronto knew what they were looking at and moved quickly enough to suggest they had been watching for exactly this kind of story. The 8th article takes us to New Orleans, Louisiana. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The New Orleans Times-Picayune ran the story buried deeper in the paper than most of the other 10 pieces. The Times-Picayune described a discovery made during dredging operations in one of the city's drainage canals. The dredge had brought up, along with expected clay and silt, a series of carved stone blocks, dress blocks with cut surfaces, and what the dredge operator described as regular markings. Not text, he said, more like geometry. Lines and angles cut into the surface of each block in a pattern consistent across all the blocks recovered. What the reporter described were incised lines forming triangular patterns, each triangle nested inside a larger triangle, all of them cut with a precision suggesting the use of instruments rather than freehand work. The blocks sat on the canal bank long enough for the reporter to see and describe them. Then they were removed for storage by a canal official. Where they were stored was not specified. Whether they were ever studied was not reported. The Times-Picayune ran no second story. The 9th article brings us to Philadelphia. The Philadelphia Inquirer's piece described a discovery made during work on the city's water main system near the original colonial settlement. Workers had broken into what the Inquirer described as a large underground space. The space was arched, with arches running in parallel rows from one end to the other, columns between them supporting the arches. The floor was stone, the columns were stone, everything was stone, and the entire structure was intact, not partially collapsed, not filled with debris, standing clean and empty, as if it had been sealed at some point in the past specifically to preserve it. The Inquirer's reporter was allowed briefly into the space before the water main supervisor ordered the entrance resealed. He estimated the space at roughly 80 feet in length and perhaps 40 feet in width, with a ceiling somewhere between 12 and 15 feet at the crown of the arches. He noted that the columns had bases and capitals of a worked stone that reminded him of images he had seen in books of ancient architecture. Not colonial, not English Georgian, something much older in its profile. The city's water department said only that the structure was a known feature of the old city's underground infrastructure and would be properly assessed before further work. That assessment was never published. The water main work was completed. The entrance to the columned hall was sealed beneath fresh paving. The Inquirer never returned to the story. The 10th and final article is the one that pulls everything together. The paper was the Chicago Tribune. The city of Chicago was at that moment in a highly charged state of anticipation, because the World Fair that had transformed its lakefront in 1893, the Columbian Exposition with its inexplicable white city of classical buildings and reflecting pools, had been over for 5 years, and the city was already in conversation about what would come next. The Tribune story described a discovery made during foundation work for a new commercial building in the South Loop district. The crew had gone deep into fill material laid after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871 and had, at a level below the fire debris, hit something that stopped their excavation in its tracks. Not a void, not a tunnel, a floor and walls, a corner, an intact structural corner of a building that predated everything the crew expected to find at that depth, a building whose cornerstone was a single dress block of a size that would have required a lifting device of a capacity not available to any construction operation the foreman had personally worked on. The Tribune reporter measured the cornerstone and wrote down its dimensions. He noted that the stone was not local limestone. It was granite of a variety he could not identify, quarried at a source he could not determine, transported to Chicago by means he could not account for, and set in place in a building that had existed beneath the level of the 1871 fire at a period of occupation for which the official historical record of Chicago has no account whatsoever. The Tribune sent the story to a professor of archaeology at the University of Chicago. He was quoted in the article saying the discovery warranted careful examination and that he would arrange a formal visit. He was never quoted in the Tribune again on this subject. The site owner had the excavation backfilled and the foundation poured before the end of the week. and within the same 7-day window that was swallowing the other 9 pieces, the Chicago story was gone. Now we have to ask the question that the official record has declined to ask for 125 years. Why all 10 in the same week? Construction in industrial cities was happening at an enormous pace in 1898. The United States and Britain were in the middle of a building boom driven by railway expansion, streetcar networks, utility infrastructure, and commercial construction. If cities all over the industrial world were digging simultaneously, multiple discoveries of unusual underground structures could plausibly occur in the same general period. But the same week is harder to explain by construction volume alone, and the disappearance of all 10 stories in the same 7-day window is harder still. To understand that disappearance, you have to understand what was happening to the newspaper industry in 1898. It was an industry in the middle of a profound consolidation, driven by the same financial mechanisms that were consolidating railroads, big steel production, and banking in the same period. The newspaper business in 1898 was expensive to run and easy to leverage. Presses, paper, ink, distribution infrastructure, telegraph access for wire stories, all of it cost money, and money meant debt, and debt meant creditors. The largest creditors in the American economy in 1898 were the great banking houses, the same institutions financing the railway boom, the steel mergers, and the real estate development driving the construction projects in which all 10 discoveries had been made. In St. Louis, Cincinnati, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and New Orleans, the men who owned the real estate being excavated, and the men whose banks were financing the newspaper presses, were frequently the same men, or men in the same immediate financial networks. This is not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense of secret meetings and coded messages. It is the ordinary operation of concentrated capital in an era before antitrust regulation had any real teeth. You do not need to instruct a newspaper to kill a story if the newspaper's creditors have a direct financial interest in the real estate being excavated, and if the newspaper's editor understands without being told explicitly that certain categories of story are not in his publication's long-term financial interest to pursue. The suppression happens not through command but through the entirely ordinary editorial calculation of what is worth following up and what is not, a calculation that in 1898 was systematically shaped by who owned what and who owed what to whom. There is a second layer to this, and it involves the world fairs. The Columbian Exposition of 1893 presented classical architecture of a precision and completeness that had not been seen in the Western world since the height of the Roman Empire. Buildings that the official record says were constructed in 18 months using steel framing and a compound of plaster and jute fibre. The photographs of those buildings show something that does not look like 18-month plaster construction. They show staining, they show wear, they show the particular density of very old stone, the way old buildings absorb light differently from new ones. Multiple researchers examining the photographs independently have noted the same thing. The White City did not look new. It looked cleaned. If that observation is even partially correct, then the world fairs were not constructions. They were presentations of something that already existed, rehabilitations of structures that the official timeline of American history has no account for, because the official timeline begins with European settlement in the 17th century, and what the fairs show is a civilization of a scope and sophistication that European settlers arriving in the 17th century should not have found, did not record finding, and whose traces have been carefully managed ever since. The Tartarian framework holds that this prior civilization left physical traces across the entire world, traces in the form of monumental architecture, traces in the form of infrastructure, canals, roads, drainage systems, underground passages, traces in the form of the precise stone cutting, the tight joinery, the non-mortar fitting, the unusual alloys, the inexplicable scale of individual stones that appears in excavation reports from every era and every continent, and is consistently explained away as colonial construction or indigenous construction. The 10 newspaper articles of spring 1898 sit inside this framework as a very specific kind of document. They are evidence that in one specific week, in 10 specific cities, professional reporters working for credible mainstream publications encountered physical remains of a prior built environment that did not fit inside the official history of any of those cities, and that every one of those encounters was managed, suppressed, and forgotten within the same 7-day period. If someone monitoring the wire services in the spring of 1898 noticed that multiple papers were running stories about buried cities in the same week, that monitoring entity would have had the capability, through financial leverage and editorial relationships, to indicate to each paper that the story did not warrant further coverage, not through explicit instruction, through the altogether more ordinary mechanism of absence. No wire service pickup, no editorial encouragement, no follow-up queries from other papers. Simply silence and the calculated absence of the amplification that would have turned a local page 3 story into a national conversation. The disappearance of all 10 stories in the same week is consistent with exactly that kind of distributed, non-explicit editorial management. It requires no single coordinating villain. It requires only a shared set of financial interests, a shared set of editorial instincts about what categories of story are not to be amplified, and the wire service infrastructure to transmit that shared instinct across the Atlantic faster than the stories themselves could gain independent traction. Each of the 10 stories was individually manageable. A buried vault in St. Louis, a paved street in Cincinnati, a seawall in San Francisco, a columned hall in Philadelphia. Individually, each of these was a curiosity that could be explained away with a 2-sentence official response, and then forgotten. But together in the same week, across 5 countries and 2 continents, 10 reporters looking at the same kind of physical evidence, all of them simultaneously coming too close to the same conclusion, that was something that required management. And management is what it received. The cities they found are still there. The vault beneath 7th Street in St. Louis has been under that street for 125 years. The paved street under Cincinnati has been under the streetcar tunnel for the same period. The columned hall in Philadelphia is sealed under successive layers of concrete. The passage in Natchez may still run from the farmer's field toward the old Spanish colonial district. The seawall in San Francisco is under the Marina district, the neighborhood built on fill placed to reclaim land for the 1915 World Fair, the fair that celebrated the opening of the Panama Canal. That detail is worth sitting with. The fair was built on fill placed over the seawall that the Chronicle reported in the same week as the other 9 stories. One layer of management on top of another, each layer confident that the one beneath it had been adequately sealed. Nothing found in those 10 weeks has been destroyed. The official project of managing these discoveries has never been a project of destruction. It has been a project of burial, of sealing, of adding layers. The prior civilization is not gone. It is underneath. It has always been underneath. And the extraordinary thing about a city is that once you pour concrete over something, it stays there through every generation of management and every wave of official explanation, waiting in the dark for the layer above it to finally ask the question it should have asked in 1898. What is actually underneath us? What was here before the settlement that the official history begins with? And why, in the spring of a year when industrial construction was simultaneously ripping up the ground of cities on 2 continents, did the answer to that question appear in 10 newspapers in the same week, and then vanish from every one of them within 7 days, as if someone somewhere, watching the wire services, had quietly decided that the world was not yet ready to find out? The 10 articles are in the archives, the microfilm is in the libraries, the cities are in the ground. And the question they raised together, a question that no single article raised alone, is still unanswered, still buried, still waiting under the streets of St. Louis and Cincinnati and San Francisco and London and Boston and Natchez and Toronto and New Orleans and Philadelphia and Chicago, exactly where the project of 1898 left it, sealed beneath 125 years of concrete and official silence and the relentless insistence that everything above the fill line is the whole of history, and everything below it is nothing anyone needs to know.